Xerion Prime's massive Colosseum was, without a doubt, the most grandiose monument to cosmic stupidity ever constructed. Rising from the purple-tinged atmosphere like some twisted marriage between ancient Roman architecture and a fever dream, the massive structure housed 50,000 screaming aliens who had apparently decided that watching other beings tear each other apart was peak entertainment. Today's crowd was particularly bloodthirsty, which, considering this was a Tuesday afternoon, said quite a lot about galactic civilization's current state of moral decay. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted multi-limbed entities, Commander Graltalk's voice boomed across the arena, his reptilian features twisted into what passed for a grin among the Morthok. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, with scales that shifted from deep emerald to burnished gold depending on his mood, currently excited sadism if the color wheel was accurate, he gestured dramatically toward the arena floor below. Today, we present something truly special for your viewing pleasure. The crowd erupted in cheers, roars, and various forms of alien applause that sounded like a percussion section having a nervous breakdown. In the premium seating, the Morthak nobility lounged on crystalline platforms, their forked tongues flicking out to taste the anticipation in the air. Below them, the scholarly Vectari hunched over data tablets, their compound eyes glittering as they recorded every detail for posterity. Because, apparently, even torture needed proper documentation in this corner of the galaxy. "We have acquired," Graltalk continued, his voice dripping with theatrical malice, "a specimen from one of the most pathetic species in known space, a creature so weak, so insignificant, that their entire planet was conquered in what their historians laughably call a minor skirmish." More cheers. Someone in the upper decks threw what looked like fermented fruit. The splatter pattern suggested excellent trajectory calculations. Clearly, even the Vectari were getting into the spirit of things. "I present to you a human." The spotlight blazed to life, illuminating a figure that looked distinctly unimpressed by the whole spectacle. Dane stood in the center of the arena, hands casually shoved into the pockets of his torn cargo pants. Brown hair disheveled from 3 weeks in a Morthak detention cell. At 35, he had the kind of weathered face that suggested a man who'd seen his share of the galaxy's less hospitable corners, and wasn't particularly surprised to find himself in another one. "Oh, wonderful," he muttered, squinting up at the screaming masses. "And here I thought my day couldn't get any more interesting." The crowd's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. This wasn't the cowering terror they'd expected. Most species, when faced with imminent death for entertainment purposes, had the decency to look properly horrified. This human appeared to be conducting a casual survey of the arena's architecture. Graltalk's scales flickered toward an annoyed orange. "Perhaps our guest requires motivation to provide proper entertainment." With a theatrical flourish, he activated a series of holographic displays around the arena. 3 separate holding chambers materialized in the projections, each containing a shadow that moved with predatory grace. The crowd's excitement returned with interest. They knew what was coming. "From the death world of Calith," Graltalk announced, his voice reaching crescendo, "we present the apex predators of a planet where survival requires cunning, strength, and an appetite for violence that would make our ancestors proud. Behold, the Shadow Maws." The first chamber came into focus, revealing a creature that looked like evolution had taken a perfectly reasonable big cat and decided to get creative with nightmare fuel. Standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, the Shadow Maw's midnight black fur rippled with muscle beneath. Its eyes glowed with an unsettling intelligence, and when it opened its mouth to snarl, rows of teeth gleamed like surgical instruments. Claws that could shred titanium scraped against the chamber floor. "Lovely," Dane observed, tilting his head as he studied the creature. "Definitely feline. Probably pack hunters, given the body language. And those eyes." He paused, frowning. "Wait a minute." The second chamber revealed another shadow maw, slightly smaller but equally impressive in the designed to end your existence department. This one paced restlessly, occasionally letting out a sound that was part roar, part electronic harmony, a vocalization that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate in the listener's bones. The third chamber housed the largest of the trio. Where the first two were impressive, this one was genuinely terrifying. 8 feet of concentrated lethality, with scars across its flanks that spoke of battles survived and enemies conquered. Its gaze swept the arena with calculating intelligence before fixing on Dane with what might have been curiosity. 3 shadow maws, Growltalk continued, his scales now cycling through pleased purples, against one pathetic human. The betting pools are already favoring a survival time of, roughly 15 seconds. In the VIP section, a Vekatari researcher named Bythos adjusted his recording equipment with 4 of his 6 arms, while taking rapid notes with the remaining 2. Unlike his colleagues, who seemed content to treat this as mere entertainment, Bythos had spent the better part of his career studying interspecies behavioral dynamics. Something about this scenario felt off. Estimated prey response suggests immediate flight reflex, he muttered into his voice recorder. However, subject displays atypical calm. Posture indicates assessment, rather than panic. Curious. Down in the arena, Dane had moved closer to the nearest holding chamber, ignoring the energy barrier that separated him from several 100 pounds of apex predator. The shadow maw inside had stopped pacing and was watching him with tilted head, a gesture so familiar that Dane felt a pang of recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. Then louder, "Hey, Growltalk! Question for you." The Morthak commander's scales shifted toward irritated red. This was not how these events typically proceeded. "What?" he snapped. "Just wondering, how long have these 3 been in captivity? What possible relevance?" "Humor me. Professional curiosity." Growltalk's forked tongue flicked out in annoyance. "They were acquired 6 months ago from a hunting expedition to Calith. The breeding program has been moderately successful." "Breeding program?" Dane's voice carried a dangerous edge that somehow cut through the arena's acoustics. Several aliens in the front rows shifted uncomfortably. "Of course! These specimens will produce excellent gladiators for future entertainments. The females are particularly—" "Females?" Dane's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, you magnificent bastards! You have no idea what you've done, do you?" The crowd was growing restless. This wasn't the blood sport they'd paid to see. Someone shouted for action. Another threw something that splattered against the arena wall with a wet sound. Growltalk's patience finally snapped. "Enough! Release the first predator." Energy crackled, and the barrier containing the smallest shadow maw dissolved. The creature emerged from its chamber with fluid grace, muscles coiling as it oriented on Dane. Its glowing eyes fixed on the human, and it began a stalking approach that had ended poorly for countless prey species across Calith. The crowd held its collective breath. Dane, rather than running screaming or falling to his knees in terror, did something completely unexpected. He sat down. Not a collapse of fear, a deliberate cross-legged seat in the center of the arena. He placed his hands on his knees, lowered his gaze to avoid direct eye contact, and began to hum. It was a low, rhythmic sound, almost like a purr but distinctly human. The kind of noise someone might make while trying to calm a frightened animal. The shadow maw stopped mid-stalk, its head tilting in confusion. This was not proper prey behavior. Prey was supposed to run, giving chase purpose. Prey was supposed to show fear, triggering predatory instincts. Prey was not supposed to sit there humming show tunes. Well, technically it was The Way You Look Tonight, but the shadow maw's musical education was somewhat limited. "What?" Growltalk sputtered. "What is it doing?" In the VIP section, Bethos leaned forward, his compound eyes focusing intensely. "Fascinating," he whispered. "The human appears to be employing submissive display behaviors while simultaneously projecting calm. This should not be effective against apex predators. Yet." The shadow maw had approached within 10 feet of Dane and stopped completely. Its snarling had ceased. Instead, it was studying this strange creature that seemed to have missed the memo about proper predator-prey dynamics. Dane continued humming, occasionally making soft clicking sounds with his tongue. To the average observer, he appeared to be having a casual musical moment before his inevitable dismemberment. To someone with extensive experience in animal behavior, however, his actions were far more deliberate. The clicking pattern matched feline communication. The humming resonated at frequencies known to have calming effects on mammalian nervous systems. His posture conveyed no threat, while also avoiding the submissive cowering that might trigger a predatory response. Most importantly, his scent, while impossible for the alien audience to detect, was telling a very different story to the shadow maw's enhanced senses. Instead of fear, sweat, and panic, Dane was projecting the complex chemical signature of someone who spent his life around animals. Someone who understood them. Someone who might, in fact, be Pack. The shadow maw took another step forward, then did something that made half the audience gasp, and the other half check their betting slips. It lay down, not in a crouch, ready-to-pounce position, but in a relaxed sprawl, front paws extended, head resting on them. Its glowing eyes remained fixed on Dane, but the murderous intent had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like curiosity? "This is unprecedented," Bythos muttered, his recording equipment working overtime. "Shadow maws are not social with non-pack members. They do not display relaxation responses to unfamiliar species. This should be impossible." Growltalk's scales were cycling through colors so rapidly he looked like a malfunctioning traffic signal. "Release the second predator," he roared. "Perhaps the human's luck will not hold twice." The second energy barrier dissolved, and another shadow maw emerged. This one was larger than the first, with more pronounced scarring along its flanks. It took in the scene: human sitting calmly, packmate lying relaxed nearby, and its reaction was immediate. It charged. The crowd roared approval. Finally, some proper violence. Dane didn't move from his seated position. As several 100 pounds of apex predator bore down on him, he simply extended one hand, palm up, and made a sound that was part whistle, part chirp. The charging shadow maw skidded to a halt 3 feet away, spraying arena sand. Its momentum carried it into a sideways slide that would have been comical if not for the razor claws leaving gouges in the ground. "Easy there, big guy," Dane said softly. "I know you're scared. It's okay." Scared? The crowd was baffled. This was a creature that could tear through reinforced steel. What could it possibly be scared of? But Dane's trained eye could see what the bloodthirsty audience missed: the tremor in the creature's flanks. the way its ears flicked nervously, the defensive positioning that spoke of trauma rather than aggression. These weren't just apex predators. They were victims. The second shadow maw approached more cautiously, sniffing the air around Dane. Whatever it scented, there seemed to satisfy some internal criteria, because it settled into a sitting position just out of arm's reach, close enough to flee, far enough to assess. "That's it," Dane murmured, still not moving from his cross-legged position. "Take your time. No rush." In the VIP section, Bythos was frantically updating his notes. Subject demonstrates advanced understanding of predator psychology. Shadow maws displaying unprecedented behavioral modification. Commander Growltalk appears to be entering apoplectic state. Indeed, the Morthak commander's color cycling had reached strobing frequency. "This is not entertainment. This is educational," suggested a voice from the crowd. Several aliens laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. Growltalk's clawed hand slammed down on the arena controls. "Release the third predator! All of them! Now!" The largest chamber's energy barrier flickered and died, but instead of the anticipated emergence of the final shadow maw, there was only silence. Dane's humming stopped. He raised his head, looking directly at the open chamber, and his expression changed from calm confidence to something approaching reverence. "Oh," he whispered. "Oh, you poor thing." The largest shadow maw emerged slowly from the chamber, and immediately it became clear why the other two had responded to Dane with such unusual behavior. This wasn't just the alpha of the group. This was their mother. Her emergence from the holding chamber was nothing like the others. Where her cubs, and yes, Dane's trained eye could now see the family resemblance in bone structure and movement patterns, had moved with youthful energy tempered by confusion, the mother shadow maw moved with the deliberate grace of a creature that had nothing left to lose. She was magnificent and heartbreaking in equal measure. Standing nearly 8 feet at the shoulder, her midnight coat bore the silver streaks of maturity, along with scars that told stories of battles fought not for sport, but for survival. Her eyes held an intelligence that made the audience's bloodthirsty cheers seem even more obscene than before. But it was the way she looked at her cubs that made Dane's chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen that expression before, in the eyes of a grizzly bear whose cubs had been relocated by wildlife services, in the frantic pacing of a wolf whose pack had been separated by highway construction. In his own mirror, the day child services had informed him that his sister's kids were being placed in different foster homes. Pure, desperate, protective love mixed with helpless rage. "Well," Dane muttered, still maintaining his seated position while his mind raced through calculations, "this changes things considerably." The crowd's enthusiasm had reached fever pitch. 3 apex predators, 1 puny human, and now what looked like an alpha female entering the mix. The betting pools were going wild, with most wagers now focusing on which piece of Dane would hit the arena wall first. "Finally!" Growltalk's voice boomed across the Colosseum, his scales settling into a satisfied gold. "Witness the fury of Calith's greatest predator. See how quickly." His commentary was cut short as the mother shadow maw did something unexpected. She ignored Dane completely. Instead, she moved directly to her cubs, who had both risen at her approach. The reunion was silent but profound. A series of head bumps, gentle nudges, and what could only be described as fierce maternal inspection for injuries. Her massive form curved protectively around the smaller creatures, and for a moment, the arena held a scene that belonged in a nature documentary rather than a gladiatorial bloodbath. "Ah," someone in the crowd said, That's actually rather sweet. Sweet, Graltok sputtered. Sweet? This is supposed to be Mortal Kombat, not family therapy. Dane watched the reunion with growing understanding. The cubs weren't just young shadow maws. They were traumatized children who'd been separated from their mother for months. The scars on the mother's flanks weren't battle wounds from territorial disputes. They were marks left by capture devices and medical instruments. 6 months, he said, loud enough for his voice to carry to the command booth. 6 months you've kept them apart. Standard protocol for breeding programs requires... Breeding programs? Dane's voice cut through the arena's acoustics like a blade. He rose to his feet for the first time since the ordeal began, and something in his posture made the nearest spectators lean back instinctively. You mean forced breeding? You mean taking cubs from their mother and using her as livestock? The mother Shadowmaw's head snapped toward Dane, her glowing eyes fixing on him with laser intensity. For the first time since entering the arena, she seemed to truly see him. Dane met her gaze directly, a gesture that should have triggered an immediate attack response. Instead, he spoke directly to her, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from years of working with traumatized animals. I know, he said simply. I know what they did to you. I know what they took. The arena fell silent. 50,000 aliens held their collective breath as Predator and humans stared at each other across 10 feet of sand-covered ground. Then the mother Shadowmaw did something that made half the audience check their universal translators for malfunction. She whimpered, not the sound of an apex predator preparing to strike, but the broken vocalization of a mother who'd endured months of separation from her children. It was a sound that transcended species barriers and spoke directly to something fundamental about family, loss, and pain. "Oh, you beautiful, heartbroken thing," Dane whispered. He took a step forward. "The Chew," crowd gasped. Several Morthak guards moved toward their weapons. Graltok's claws extended reflexively. Dane took another step, then slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to one knee. It was a position that left him completely vulnerable to attack, while simultaneously showing respect without submission. "I had a sister," he said, his voice pitched for the Shadowmaw's acute hearing rather than the audience. "She had 2 kids. Beautiful, brilliant, impossible children who could make me laugh even on my worst days." His voice caught slightly. Child services said it was better to separate them. Different homes, different families. Said they'd adjust faster that way. The mother Shadowmaw's ears flicked forward, tracking his voice with obvious attention. They never did adjust. Emma cried for her brother every night for months. Little Matt stopped talking altogether. And Dane's hands clenched into fists before consciously relaxing. "I spent 2 years fighting a system that valued efficiency over family, logic over love." In the VIP section, Bythos had stopped taking notes. His compound eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding below, and his voice recorder captured only silence. "The thing about humans," Dane continued, his voice growing stronger, "is that we're pack animals too. We understand what it means to protect family. We understand what it costs to lose them." The mother Shadowmaw took a tentative step toward him. Her cubs flanked her movement, maintaining close formation, but following her lead. "We also understand," Dane said, rising slowly to his feet, "what it takes to get them back." Graltok's patience finally shattered completely. "Enough of this sentimental nonsense. Guards, flood the arena with Calorian gas. End this farce." Several things happened simultaneously. Bythos leaped from his observation post, his 6 arms working frantically to override the gas release system. Wait! This behavioral modification is unprecedented. We cannot terminate the study. The Mother Shadowmaw's head whipped toward Graltok's command booth, her lips pulling back to reveal teeth that could punch through ship hull. Her snarl was a sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the brainstem's "Run away now" center. And Dane, rather than showing alarm at the threat of lethal gas or the proximity of an agitated apex predator, smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of expression that suggested someone had just made a tactical error of considerable magnitude. You know what the real difference is between humans and most other species, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden tension. Most species see a problem and adapt to it. Humans see a problem and fix it. The arena's environmental controls sparked and died as Bythos successfully sabotaged the gas system. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows that made the scene look even more ominous. We're also, Dane continued, approaching the Mother Shadowmaw with steady confidence, really good at making friends. He extended his hand toward the massive predator, not demanding contact, but offering it. The mother studied his face for a long moment, then leaned forward to scent his palm. Whatever she found there satisfied her, because she pressed her enormous head gently against his hand. The touch lasted only seconds, but its impact on the arena was electric. Here was an apex predator, a creature bred for violence and honed by evolution into a perfect killing machine, showing trust to a member of what was supposedly the galaxy's most pathetic species. Impossible, someone whispered in the stands. Unprecedented, Bythos breathed into his recorder. Profitable, murmured a Vectari bookmaker who was frantically recalculating odds. Dane scratched gently behind the Shadowmaw's ear, a gesture that made her eyes close in what looked suspiciously like contentment. The cubs are beautiful, he told her. You should be proud. They're brave, intelligent, and they never stopped hoping you'd come back. As if summoned by his words, the 2 younger Shadowmaws approached, pressing close to their mother's flanks. The family reunion was complete, and for a moment the arena held a scene of perfect peace, which was, naturally, when Graltok completely lost his mind. "Kill them all!" he screamed, his scales cycling through colors so rapidly he looked like a malfunctioning hologram. "Release the backup predators! Activate the arena weapons! I want that human torn to pieces!" Emergency klaxons began wailing as concealed weapons systems emerged from the arena walls. Energy cannons swiveled toward the small group in the center of the sand. The Mother Shadowmaw's peaceful expression vanished, replaced by something that made her earlier snarl look like a polite greeting. She moved to shield her cubs, her body language shifting into pure protective aggression. Dane looked up at the weapons targeting them, then at the family he'd somehow found himself protecting, then back at Graltok's command booth. "Well," he said conversationally, "this should be interesting." The first energy blast scorched the sand where they'd been standing, but they were no longer there. The Shadowmaws had moved with liquid grace, their natural agility enhanced by months of pent-up frustration and the protective fury of a reunited family. Dane found himself swept along in their coordinated motion, not carried, but included, as if he'd somehow become part of their pack dynamic without quite realizing when it happened. They materialized behind one of the arena's structural supports, the massive pillar providing temporary cover from the energy weapons that were now systematically reducing the center of the arena to glowing slag. "Okay," Dane panted, pressed against the pillar with 3 apex predators arranged around him in what was unmistakably a protective formation. This is either the best or worst day I've had in quite some time. The mother, Shadowmaw, made a low, rumbling sound that somehow conveyed both amusement and determination. Her cubs flanked Dane's position, their glowing eyes tracking the weapon emplacements with predatory focus. Above them, Growltalk's voice echoed through the arena's public address system, his words distorted by rage and disbelief. Where are they? How did they find them? Kill them all. Sir, came a nervous Morthak guard's response over the comm. The weapons systems are showing no life signs in the target area. They've vanished. Nothing vanishes in my arena. Search every corner. Activate every sensor. Flood the entire complex with... His commands were interrupted by a new voice cutting through the chaos. Bythos had apparently gained access to the communication system, and his calm, scientific tone provided a stark contrast to Growltalk's hysteria. Fascinating behavioral adaptation in progress, the Vectari researcher announced to the entire stadium. Human subject has successfully integrated with Shadowmaw pack structure. This represents the first recorded instance of interspecies adoption by Calithian apex predators. I don't care about your research, Growltalk screamed. I want them dead. Actually, Bythos continued with the unflappable dedication of a true academic. You might want to reconsider that position, Commander. The implications for xenobiology alone could... The communication system died with a burst of static, as Growltalk apparently destroyed something important in his command booth. Dane peered around the edge of their cover, assessing their situation. The arena was a killing field of energy blasts and searchlights, but the structural supports provided a maze of potential cover. More importantly, he'd noticed something during their mad dash to safety. The drainage system, he murmured to himself, then looked at the mother, Shadowmaw. You can probably hear the water flow, can't you? There's a whole network under this place. She tilted her massive head, then made a soft chuffing sound that seemed to indicate agreement. One of her cubs, the male, Dane thought, pressed closer to the pillar and began sniffing along its base. Smart kids you've got there, Dane told the mother. They're already thinking like a team. The female cub suddenly froze, her ears swiveling toward a section of wall that looked identical to every other section. But her enhanced senses had apparently detected something human eyes couldn't see. What is it, girl? Dane whispered. In response, she moved to the wall and began pawing at what appeared to be solid stone. Her claws found purchase in hairline cracks, and suddenly a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges. Service tunnel, Dane breathed. Of course, they'd need maintenance access to the arena systems. The mother Shadowmaw studied the opening, then looked back at Dane with an expression that clearly asked, Are you coming or not? Lady, Dane said with genuine admiration, I think I'm falling in love with your entire family. They slipped into the tunnel just as another barrage of energy blasts reduced their former hiding spot to smoking rubble. The passage was narrow but tall enough for the Shadowmaws to move comfortably, and it stretched into darkness that posed no problem for their enhanced vision. For Dane, it was like being guided through a cave system by the galaxy's most lethal tour guides. The tunnels branched and intersected in a complex network that served the arena's infrastructure. Cooling systems, power conduits, and waste management all had their dedicated pathways. But what caught Dane's attention were the sounds echoing through the service spaces. Other creatures. Lots of them. This isn't just an arena, he realized aloud. It's a whole facility. Breeding programs, research labs, holding pens. His voice hardened. How many families have they torn apart? The mother Shadow Maw's answering growl suggested she was wondering the same thing. They emerged from the tunnels into a vast underground complex that made the arena above seem like a mere showroom. Rows upon rows of containment units stretched into the distance, each one housing creatures from across the galaxy. The air hummed with the sound of environmental systems working to maintain dozens of different atmospheric requirements. Sweet mother of... Dane's voice trailed off as the scope of the operation became clear. This isn't entertainment. It's industrialized suffering. Some of the creatures were obviously predators, things with too many teeth and not enough patience. But others were clearly herbivores, their large eyes reflecting confusion and fear. There were pack animals separated from their groups, territorial species crammed into inadequate spaces, and social creatures isolated in solitary confinement. Every single containment unit represented someone's family, torn apart for profit. The Shadow Maw cubs had moved ahead, investigating the nearest holding cells with intense curiosity. Their mother remained close to Dane, but her attention was fixed on the broader complex with obvious recognition. "You've been down here before," Dane said quietly. "They brought you here for breeding attempts." Her snarl was answer enough. "How many others?" he asked, gesturing toward the endless rows of cells. "How many families?" Instead of answering directly, she moved to the nearest control panel, a surprisingly sophisticated piece of technology that managed the environmental systems for an entire section of cells. She studied it for a moment, then looked back at Dane with an expression that was unmistakably expectant. "You want me to—" He approached the panel, his years as a cargo pilot providing just enough technical knowledge to understand the basic interface. "I can probably figure out how to open individual cells, but the security protocols will—" His analysis was interrupted by the arrival of Bythos, who emerged from a different tunnel access, with his 6 arms full of equipment and his compound eyes bright with excitement. "Don't stop on my account," the Vectari researcher said cheerfully. "I've been trying to gain access to this facility's lower levels for months. Security protocols are quite sophisticated, but I've brought several override devices that should—" "You want to help?" Dane interrupted. "Why?" Bythos set down his equipment and began assembling what looked like a hacking device designed by someone with far too many limbs. "Professional curiosity, primarily. Also, I suspect my research funding comes from sources I'd prefer not to support. And, finally," he paused in his assembly work, "I have cubs of my own. 6 of them, actually. The idea of separation—" His voice took on a distinctly protective edge. "Some things transcend species boundaries." "Family," Dane said simply. "Precisely." Working together, they began the process of overriding the containment systems. It was delicate work, too fast, and they'd trigger every security alert in the facility. Too slow, and Graltok's forces would eventually track them down. But they had advantages the facility's designers hadn't anticipated. Bythos understood the technology intimately, his researchers' access providing detailed knowledge of the system architecture. Dane understood the creatures, his behavioral training allowing him to predict which ones could be safely released and which ones needed more careful handling. And the Shadow Maws. The Shadow Maws understood vengeance. As the first containment cells opened and creatures began emerging into the corridors, the mother Shadow Maw demonstrated why she was the apex predator of a death world. Her vocalizations carried through the complex. Not roars of challenge, but coordinated communication signals that spoke to something fundamental about pack dynamics and cooperative hunting. The released creatures began organizing themselves with startling efficiency. Predators formed hunting groups. Herbivores clustered into protective herds. Pack animals reunited with obvious joy and relief. "Remarkable," Bythos whispered, his recording equipment working overtime. "They're forming a multi-species alliance. The behavioral implications are—" His academic enthusiasm was interrupted by the sound of Morthak forces finally breaching the lower levels. Shouted orders and energy weapon discharge echoed through the corridors as Graltok's guards realized they were no longer dealing with a simple arena escape. They were facing a full-scale prison break. "How many more sections?" Dane asked, working frantically to open the remaining cells in their area. "3 more major holding areas," Bythos replied, his override devices working on multiple systems simultaneously. "Perhaps 200 creatures total." 200 families, Dane corrected. The mother Shadowmaw appeared at his shoulder, her cubs flanking her in perfect formation. But now they weren't alone. A pack of wolf-like creatures from the Rigel system had joined them, along with what appeared to be a family of 6-legged bears from somewhere in the outer rim. She looked at Dane with an expression that needed no translation. "Ready for the next part?" "You know," Dane said, watching their growing army of liberated creatures, "I'm starting to think we might actually pull this off." Above them, the sounds of battle were getting closer. Graltok's forces were converging on their position, but they were about to discover something that military tacticians across the galaxy had somehow failed to appreciate. Apex predators fight much differently when they're protecting family, instead of performing for entertainment. And humans, it turned out, were very good at bringing out the protective instincts in others. The battle for the lower levels of Zerion Prime's entertainment complex was not, by any reasonable military standard, a fair fight. On one side, heavily armed Morthak guards with energy weapons, tactical armor, and the full technological superiority of a space-faring civilization that had conquered half the sector through superior firepower and ruthless efficiency. On the other side, 200 extremely angry creatures who had just been reunited with their families after months of forced separation, guided by a human cargo pilot with a background in animal psychology and a 6-armed researcher with a talent for sabotage. The Morthak never stood a chance. "Contact in Sector 5!" screamed a guard's voice over the comm system before it dissolved into static, and what sounded distinctly like large teeth meeting soft flesh. "They're coordinating! How are they?" The transmission ended with a wet crunch. Graltok's voice echoed through the facility's emergency speakers, his words distorted by panic and disbelief. "This is impossible. They're animals. They don't use tactics." Dane, riding on the back of the mother Shadowmaw as she led their multi-species assault force through the complex's main corridors, couldn't help but laugh. "That's your first mistake, you scaly bastard. We're all animals. We're just better at it than you thought." The Shadowmaw cubs flanked their improvised formation, the male leading a pack of Rigelian wolf analogues in harassing attacks against the guards' flanks, while the female coordinated with the 6-legged bears to provide heavy assault support. Behind them, a parade of liberated creatures followed in organized chaos that looked random but was actually devastatingly effective. Bythos skittered alongside on his 6 legs, his equipment pack bouncing as he worked to override security systems in real time. "Facility schematics indicate your ship is being held in the upper-level impound bay," he called out between energy weapon discharges. "But the access routes are heavily defended." "Then we make new access routes," Dane replied, patting the mother Shadowmaw's neck. "Think you and your family are up for some remodeling work?" Her answering purr was felt as much as heard, a vibration that somehow conveyed both affection and predatory anticipation. They reached the main elevator bank that connected the lower levels to the arena complex above. The lifts had been disabled as a security measure, but the Shadow Maws had already identified an alternative approach that the facility's designers had never considered. Sometimes the direct route was the best route. The mother Shadow Maw reared back on her hind legs and drove her front claws into the elevator shaft's reinforced wall. Sparks flew as talons designed to punch through the armor of Calithian mega-predators made short work of construction materials that were only rated for structural integrity, not determined maternal fury. Within minutes, they had carved a climbing path straight up the elevator shaft that would have made mountaineers weep with envy. "After you," Dane said politely to the family of bears, who began scaling the improvised route with surprising grace for creatures the size of small shuttles. The ascent was a study in controlled chaos. Each species contributed their natural abilities to the collective effort. Climbers went first to secure routes, flyers provided reconnaissance, and the various predator species formed a defensive perimeter that discouraged pursuit from below. At the halfway point, they encountered their first serious resistance. A squad of Morthak elite guards had positioned themselves at the elevator shaft opening, energy weapons trained on the climbing creatures. Their leader, a particularly large specimen with ceremonial scars indicating veteran status, gestured dramatically as his subordinates prepared to fire. "This ends now, abominations! You will return to your cells or—" His tactical analysis was interrupted by the arrival of the female Shadow Maw cub, who had apparently taken a different route through the facility's ventilation system. She emerged from an air duct directly behind the guards and announced her presence with a vocalization that could best be described as polite greeting from your new apex predator overlord. The guards spun around just in time to meet the rest of the rescue party, who had used the distraction to complete their climb. The ensuing confrontation was brief, decisive, and educational for anyone who might have been under the impression that superior technology automatically trumped superior motivation. "Facility map indicates the impound bay is through this section," Bythos announced, consulting his pilfered schematics while stepping carefully around unconscious guards. However, Commander Graltok has likely activated the emergency protocols. Expect significant resistance. They found the impound bay and significant resistance. Graltok himself stood before Dane's cargo hauler, flanked by his remaining guards and backed by automated defense turrets that tracked their approach with mechanical precision. His scales had settled into the deep red of pure rage, and his clawed hands held a weapon that looked capable of reducing their entire group to component molecules. "You have caused enough chaos, human," he snarled. "Surrender now, and I will ensure your death is merely agonizing rather than creatively prolonged." Dane slid down from the mother Shadow Maw's back and walked forward with the casual confidence of someone who had spent the day fundamentally redefining interspecies relations. "You know, Graltok, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about humans being pathetic and weak. You are. Your entire species is a footnote in galactic history. See? That's where you're wrong." Dane gestured toward the creatures arrayed behind him, dozens of species that had formed an alliance based on shared experience and mutual protection. "Humans aren't strong because we're apex predators. We're strong because we're apex pack builders." The mother Shadow Maw stepped up beside him, her cubs taking positions on either side. The message was clear. This was no longer a human facing alien captors. This was a pack leader backed by family. "We don't just adapt to our environment," Dane continued. "We make everything else part of our pack, including creatures that were supposedly designed to kill us." Graltok raised his weapon. "Enough philosophy! Die!" The energy blast that should have reduced Dane to atoms instead struck empty air. The entire pack had moved as one, flowing around the attack with coordinated precision that spoke to hours of practice rather than minutes of acquaintance. What followed was less a battle than a demonstration of why evolution favored cooperation over conquest. When the dust settled and the automated turrets lay in sparking ruins, Graltok found himself backed against Dane's cargo hauler with 200 liberated creatures arranged in a semicircle around him. His weapon was gone, his guards were unconscious, and his scales had faded to the pale gray of absolute defeat. "Here's what's going to happen," Dane said conversationally. "You're going to transfer ownership of this entire facility to our friend Bythos here, who's going to convert it into a rehabilitation center for traumatized creatures. You're going to provide reparations to every family you've separated, and you're going to send a message to every other entertainment complex in the sector explaining exactly why tearing families apart for profit is a really bad idea." "And if I refuse?" Dane looked back at the Mother Shadowmaw, who had approached to stand directly behind him. Her massive form cast Graltok in shadow, and her glowing eyes reflected a promise that transcended language barriers. "Well," Dane said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I suppose you could ask my friend here what she thinks about that option." Graltok's surrender was immediate and comprehensive. An hour later, Dane stood at the cargo ramp of his ship, watching as families of creatures were reunited throughout the complex. Shadowmaw cubs were actually playing, with other young creatures from different species, while their mothers supervised with the patient attention of someone who had thought she'd never see such joy again. Bythos approached, his 6 arms juggling multiple data tablets. "The facility conversion will take some time, but I believe we can establish proper rehabilitation protocols within a few months. Where will you go?" Dane looked up at the stars visible through the facility's damaged ceiling, then back at the Shadowmaw family. "Wherever the next family needs help, I suppose." The Mother Shadowmaw made a questioning sound, tilting her massive head toward the ship. "You want to come along?" Dane asked, then laughed at his own question. "Of course you do. After all," he scratched behind her ear with familiar affection, "we're packed now." As Dane's cargo hauler lifted off from Xerion Prime, it carried more than just a human and 3 Shadowmaws. It carried the beginning of something new in galactic relations, the understanding that strength wasn't measured in firepower or conquest, but in the willingness to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Behind them, the facility that had once been a monument to cruelty began its transformation into something better. And across the galaxy, other entertainment complexes began receiving a very unusual message about the inadvisability of separating families. After all, you never knew when a pack-building apex predator might take it personally. And humans, it turned out, took everything personally when it came to family.